Welcome. My name is Dr. Wesley Sanders. I'm a psychologist at Homebase, and I'll be presenting today some information about PTSD, as well as PTSD treatments that we offer here at Homebase. So before we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, it's often really most helpful to talk about the T part first, T being the trauma part. And what is trauma? What makes something a traumatic event? So the core pieces of a traumatic event really reflect some theme of a life or death situation. So some sort of threat to ourselves, a near-death experience, a threat to others, so other people who might be experiencing a near-death experience, or witnessing the experience of death in others. In some cases, it can also be indirectly learning. So for example, if you were a service member at the FOB and your buddy went out that day outside the wire and didn't come back, and you weren't there with them, even though you did not witness that experience, that can also be indirectly traumatic. Or if you are operating drones, drone pilot, you might not be physically present for some of the loss of life involved, but that repeated exposure can also be traumatic in and of itself. There's also, not always, but often, a combined feeling of helplessness or loss of control. This can be a literal thing, meaning being pinned down by a vehicle after hitting an IED and taking small arms fire. That feeling of physical helplessness, being unable to respond to that threat, can add to that traumatic experience. It can also be a loss of control, more in the sense of being unable to stop or prevent or change the direction of events going on, even if you weren't physically present in some of these situations. And finally, it evokes a strong emotional response, usually fear, intense fear response during a life or death situation. This might not always be physically noticeable, but there's of course something going on under the hood in these situations with regards to that strong emotional response that we might be having during that traumatic event. So the reason I wanted to highlight trauma and the definition of trauma that we use in understanding post-traumatic stress disorder is because this experience of trauma actually affects the brain differently. So in this image here that I have up on the slide, you'll notice that there's one portion of the brain that's highlighted in purple. This is the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is what's responsible for higher order thinking. It's what allows us to plan our day, to anticipate consequences, to think about the future, to make your grocery store checklist. All of those kinds of situations involve thinking and planning and prioritizing different factors about your day or your experiences. Teenagers, one of the reasons why they often can make impulsive decisions is because this is the last part of our brain to develop. So teenagers sometimes don't have this part of their brain fully developed, which can lead to sometimes not anticipating fully the consequences of those kinds of behaviors. So it's a pretty important part of the brain. And it's one we use every day. And one of the things about trauma that's very interesting is that there's evidence to show this part of our brain deactivates or limits its activation during a traumatic event. What activates instead is the subcortical area of the amygdala. This is also known as the fear center of our brain. So the analogy that I find helpful to think about this process is to imagine your brain going into battery saver mode, much like your phone might do. When your phone goes into battery saver mode, what it's really doing is activating processes like limiting the screen brightness or restricting access to certain applications and really streamlining the functions of that phone to ensure that it minimizes battery use and keeps the phone alive a little bit longer. Your brain does the same thing during a traumatic event. It goes into survival mode. And in survival mode, it's really focused on three primary survival responses. fight, flight, or freeze. Now, many folks have probably heard of fight or flight. Freeze, however, is also a instinctive biological survival response. None of these are necessarily choices that we make. They are instantaneous reactions that our body goes into. And much like fight or flight, freeze can have a lot of adaptive aspects to it in terms of our survival. Sometimes being able to freeze limits the visualization of ourselves from others. It's harder to see us if we're not moving. Sometimes staying put can reduce the risk for harm that fighting or running away might present if we try to do those things. And in the military context, the truth is sometimes sticking our head above the berm when we're taking enemy fire isn't the most adaptive thing to do for our survival. It's just something that we are trained to do for the sake of our unit and for our mission. And sometimes the unit's survival and that mission are efforts that the military makes to train over our survival response. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't work. Our survival response is instinctive, it's primal, and it kicks in during these survival moments. I wanted to highlight the freeze response in particular because many veterans who seek services struggle with this biological response as compared to fight or flight. There's often this misconception that freezing is an act of cowardice or a lack of moral character. In fact, it is a biological response. It's not a choice. It's our body's attempt to keep us alive. And if I'm ever meeting with a patient who is able to speak with me today, it's because their brain tried its best to keep them alive and also oftentimes effectively does so. So if that's what happens during a traumatic event, what happens after the traumatic event? And before we talk about how the brain processes the memory of a traumatic event, I wanted to speak briefly about how our brain tends to process any memory in long-term storage. And to use a common example of a really pleasant experience, a really positive moment, prideful moment in a lot of families' lives, the birth of a child can be a really powerful, happy memory or powerful, positive memory for those who have had the experience. And to illustrate how we store these memories in our long-term memory storage, the analogy I find helpful is to think about that memory as like a balloon. So like a balloon, that memory is something that kind of bubbles up in our consciousness. And during that special moment in our lives, like the birth of a child or a wedding day, or just a really happy memory in our lives, that memory is created in the moment and it bubbles up to the surface and it's buoyed by being filled with the helium of our emotions. So in this case, maybe happiness, joy, pride, those strong emotions fill that balloon and bring it up to our consciousness and we think about it. And so maybe we're talking about it with our friends. Maybe we're sharing pictures with our loved ones. Maybe we're just reflecting on that day in the coming weeks and months as we process that memory. But ultimately, we're thinking about it, and thinking about it. And eventually that memory is what's called consolidated. It's stored away in our long-term storage. The balloon deflates. The emotions and the thoughts aren't there the same way they were the first time. We're likely not thinking about our wedding day every day of our lives many years down the road. But of course, we're still able to recall that memory and share that with others who ask about that experience. So it's stored away. Sometimes we have to store memories that aren't very exciting. If we've ever had to study for a test or do something over and over again to be able to remember it, that's our attempt to fill that balloon, maybe with just plain old air. It's not very emotional, it's not very strong. We have to kind of purposely bring it up to the surface because it's not bubbling up on its own. But either way, it's the same process of being able to talk about it, read about it, study it, and then store it in our long-term memory storage. Post-traumatic stress disorder and the trauma memories that come with it are really no different than any other memory stored in our long-term storage. The big difference here is that there is a string attached. So traumatic memories, much like any other memory, are still filled with that emotional helium. But that emotional helium, instead of being pride or joy or happiness, In this case, can be really negative emotions like fear or terror or extreme anger. And when that memory comes up, triggered by a smell or a sound or something on TV or something someone says, it can bring that string along with it. And that string includes symptoms like fear, heart rate going up, rapid breathing, panicky feelings. Basically, our body signals that we are in danger. This is where we can have experiences that confuse our mind, where our body is telling us we're in danger, or remembering this terrible, terrible experience, and the confusion around that can actually make us feel like it's happening all over again, or like we're re-experiencing that moment. No one wants to feel this way. This is not something that anyone wants to linger on or experience any more than absolutely necessary. It's a terrible sensation when these memories come up. They can be incredibly frightening. And so the natural human response in this situation is to try to avoid, try to get away from this memory. And up to this point, everything that I've talked about, if you've experienced these reactions to a traumatic event, it does not mean that you have post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the response that everyone goes through after a traumatic event. What tends to happen though is over time, we allow that memory to be present for as long as we can tolerate. And then we kind of step away, we distract ourselves. But slowly but surely, we allow more of that memory to be present and allow ourselves to process it. And it becomes a little bit easier to think about. And of course, then that string starts to fall away. The memory balloon deflates. It's stored in our long-term storage, just like all those other memories. It's a painful memory. It's a difficult memory to think about at times, but it's not bubbling up into our consciousness every day. Where post-traumatic stress disorder can come about is when we make a lot of attempts to maintain this avoidance, so much so that we might accommodate our lifestyle around our avoidance. So if we move to a really rural area, if we break off connections with our loved ones or with people we serve with, if we isolate and reduce any exposure to any potential reminder or trigger of that memory, and we sustain that in a long-term, maybe even kind of lifelong attempt to reduce that access to the memory, what can happen is that the avoidance prevents this memory from getting consolidated and stored away. So anytime it comes back up, we're right back at square one with all of that string attached. And what can develop is a cycle. We push the memory down below the surface of our thinking by distracting ourselves or staying busy or isolating, but it's not gone, and it comes back whenever it wants to, which can be really disorienting and distressing. So our avoidance isn't really addressing it, but it's also the only tool we know to try to minimize our exposure to the memory. This is where the post-traumatic stress disorder piece can come in, is when we get stuck in this cycle. So up to this point, I've already talked about actually 2 of the 4 symptoms of PTSD. The first symptom of PTSD are what are called intrusions. These are memories of the traumatic experience that just barge into our thinking. We're not trying to think about it. Maybe a sound or a certain smell or something someone says, kind of mentions offhand, suddenly brings back that memory. It brings with it these physical sensations, these strong negative emotions. It can also come up in the form of flashbacks, like a vivid image or video kind of replaying in our mind. It can also bring nightmares coming up in our sleep, or basically whenever we kind of let our guard down and we try to go to bed at night. And these intrusions lead to avoidance. Avoidance can be of external reminders, meaning things in our environment, the bag of trash on the side of the road, driving, avoiding driving altogether, staying away from crowded areas, anything that might bring up that sensation of danger, ensuring that we never ever feel like we're stuck in a situation and always have an exit strategy. It can also be avoidance of just thinking about the trauma or talking about the trauma. This might mean, avoiding other people we serve with, avoiding military movies or any movies that might have some sort of element of our military service. It can also mean distracting ourselves, staying very busy, or using drugs or alcohol to numb our thoughts or our feelings or really anything coming up in our thinking. these kinds of situations that we avoid start to really narrow our life because we're isolating from a lot of these experiences and, of course, slowly minimizing our ability to kind of enjoy and experience the life around us. And the third symptom of PTSD that can add to this are what are called arousal symptoms. So by arousal, I mean our body's threat detection system. And one of the most common symptoms a lot of veterans talk about and a lot of folks ask about is hypervigilance. And this one tends to be a tricky one for a lot of folks because the idea around vigilance, especially in the military community, is often that more is better, right? Being more vigilant is better. It helps you stay safer. But hypervigilance is a symptom of vigilance that goes beyond its usefulness, where we spend a lot of time really rigidly having to have things a certain way to be able to constantly monitor our surroundings, constantly looking out for danger, constantly on edge, planning for potential dangerous situations to happen. And it can really get in the way of our life, our ability to enjoy the meal that we're eating, to listen to conversation, to experience our kids' recital that we're at. It can affect our concentration, our sleep. We can become more easily startled. And of course, as we experience this over and over again and we're getting more exhausted trying to maintain it, a lot of irritability and frustration and anger challenges can come up in these kinds of situations. And sometimes we go the opposite way, where we seek out dangerous situations or situations that evoke that similar adrenaline rush that we remember from our combat experience or military deployment experiences in ways that can also be problematic or destructive too. The fourth and final group of symptoms of PTSD are those related to negative beliefs and emotions. So you'll probably notice this list is a little bit longer because it includes a lot of different ways that PTSD can have a negative effect on our mind. We can struggle with negative beliefs about ourselves or about what happened or why it happened. This is where a lot of folks might be playing the coulda, woulda, shouldas game around what did I do, what could have I done differently, a lot of self-blame. A lot of these symptoms overlap with symptoms of depression. In fact, depression is a common, what we call comorbid disorder, meaning that a lot of folks who struggle with PTSD also might struggle with feeling depressed. One of the words here, anhedonia, if you think about the word hedonism as the pursuit of pleasure, anhedonia is being unable to get pleasure. And this combined with generally feeling emotionally numb and experiencing those intrusive balloons we talked about earlier can really make a combination in a way that can become very distressing and discouraging. And in fact, sometimes thoughts of suicide come up around these kinds of difficulties because of that feeling of being trapped in these difficult emotional experiences. Okay, so those are the core symptoms of PTSD. And I wanted to talk now about some of the treatments that we use for PTSD. And before I do that, I wanted to just highlight in front of us the four groups of symptoms once again. And these two therapies that I'm going to talk about are what are called evidence-based therapies. What this means is that they have been tested in randomized clinical trials, and they've been found to be significantly more effective than treatment as usual. Oftentimes, these treatment as usual experiences are supportive therapy or talk therapy, which can be enormously helpful to have someone to just bend the ear, offer support, make suggestions, and be generally very helpful as a therapist. But these two therapies have been found to be significantly more effective for the treatment of PTSD. The first therapy intervention takes a look at all four of these symptoms, and this therapy argues, okay, the intrusions lead to my avoidance, which creates this cycle that can become very distressing. Over at the arousal symptoms, that hypervigilance reinforces my avoidance because I'm always looking out for danger to avoid. So the purpose is to maintain my avoidance. And then, of course, being stuck in this cycle over and over again is very discouraging, which can contribute to a lot of negative beliefs about myself, a lot of difficulties with my mood and depression. And so this therapy argues that one of the best ways to intervene in this cycle is a very direct route. This is called prolonged exposure therapy. And prolonged exposure therapy has two major approaches. One is called in vivo therapy. In vivo therapy means in life, and it's all about re-exposing ourselves to situations in the present that we normally avoid. So the idea here is to attain what's called habituation. The more we do something over and over and over again, the more our body acclimates or gets used to that experience and starts to adjust. So if I go to the cafe every day for a week and I'm able to sit in that cafe for 45 minutes or an hour, and my body recognizes that it can be safe in that situation, I will start to experience what's called habituation. My body gets used to it, and my distress level goes down. One of the systems that we use to identify what that distress level is something called SUDS, which stands for Subjective Units of Distress Scale. Subjective meaning our own internal experience. So this measure of distress is akin to the pain scale that you might have at the doctor, where the doctor says, what is your pain on a 0 to 10 scale? They can't see your pain, they can't feel your pain, only you can feel and experience that pain. So we use that 0 to 10 scale to communicate it to the doctor for them to understand a little bit about the severity of your pain. SUDS is the same kind of idea. This is really just attached to that experience of distress. So going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, when we talked about that survival response, that fight, flight, or freeze response, the level of intensity of that desire to get the heck out of there or to fight for our survival, that's our distress response. So if you've ever seen someone or been yourself at a family gathering, for example, and you start to notice getting really antsy, like, I gotta get out of here, I gotta leave. That feeling that you're experiencing, that urge to escape and leave, is actually a distress response. And we would use the SUD scale from 0 to 100, 100 being the most distress you've ever experienced, as a way to measure that process. So getting back to in vivo then, for the in vivo therapy, it's all about the present. It's all about exposing ourselves to situations that we normally avoid, like crowds or different types of media, things like that, and habituating so that our SUDS gradually comes down. In individual therapy, the other piece we use is called imaginable exposure. So if in vivo exposure is all about the present, imaginal exposure is all about the past. And the idea here is that rather than wait for that balloon to bubble up to the surface when we least expect it as an intrusion, the goal is to purposefully turn around, face that fear, hold that memory by the string, and actually talk about it. Talk about what happened in detail, and do this over and over again with the goal of building up that habituation. Because we know with enough repeated retellings, that balloon will start to deflate, the string will start to fall away. And so the next time that memory comes up, we'll be much less distressed when it bubbles up into our consciousness. And in fact, it's less likely to do so once we find a way to allow that emotion and that memory to get processed. It's also just a very helpful experience for empowerment. Being able to know that I can tolerate this emotion, that it does not have control of me, that I can experience it and still survive and be okay and find a way to re-engage afterwards is incredibly empowering. And it can actually take the power away from that memory to control what we do, when we do it, where we go, who we go with, and the demand that it can place on our life. So this experience can be incredibly powerful for folks who find this therapy helpful. The other piece about prolonged exposure therapy is that there is a homework component of continuing to listen to recordings of the sessions. The goal here is twofold. On the one hand, it's helpful for habituation. More repeated retellings and listening can be helpful for faster habituation. But on the other hand, there's something powerful about listening to ourselves talk out loud about an experience. A lot of folks describe feeling more empathetic towards themselves when they hear their voice rather than saying it out loud themselves. It gives us a chance to step away from ourselves and offer some empathy and some compassion, which can be really powerful for building that closure around the experience. So that's one therapy that can be helpful for addressing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. The second therapy takes a different approach. This therapeutic approach focuses on the negative beliefs and mood section of post-traumatic stress disorder. So a common belief, for example, that a lot of folks experience after a deployed or traumatic experience is that the world's dangerous. You could die anytime. People don't understand how dangerous it is out there. I've seen, for example, if I've been deployed, I've seen the horrible things that people can do to one another, and I know just how dangerous it can be to step out that front door. If I believe this thought completely, then I'm probably not going to change my avoidance. I'm going to make my perimeter as small as possible. I'm also probably not going to reduce my hypervigilance because I believe I have to maintain it because I could die at any time. Until I change my beliefs, this therapy argues, I likely won't change my behavior in these other domains. So this therapy, which is called cognitive processing therapy, focuses on addressing these beliefs. And the goal of cognitive processing therapy is to create flexibility in our thinking. So for example, if I am willing to allow that sometimes in some situations with some people, I can be safe, then what that means is that sometimes in some situations with some people, I can reduce my avoidance, or I can reduce my hypervigilance. I can change my efforts to protect myself based on the situation I'm in, rather than this earlier belief, which is more universal and really doesn't have any flexibility for different settings. So the goal of cognitive processing therapy is to challenge these beliefs that have been developed through our experience of trauma. I'll give another example here. Oftentimes after a traumatic event, we are looking back towards our understanding of the world growing up as a way to understand a terrible experience like a traumatic event. One of the things that we might look to are kind of the simpler ways we've understood the world when we were growing up. For example, a lot of us learn when we're kids that if we're a good kid, good things will happen to us. But if we're a bad kid, we act up, we're going to get in trouble. And that belief sticks with us that if we're good, good things will happen to us. But if we're bad, then bad things will happen to us. And after a traumatic event, when something truly horrific happens to us, if we believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, then the logic would dictate that this bad thing happened to us because we did something wrong, or maybe we deserved it. So sometimes we develop beliefs about ourselves after a traumatic event. If I had just done X, Y, or Z, if I had turned left instead of right, if I had listened when this person said this thing, if I had just been there 5 minutes earlier, I could have prevented this from happening. And we judge ourselves and blame ourselves and struggle with that blame. Survivor's guilt can often be this experience of why did I survive when someone else did not survive? They were so good, they were a good person, I cherished my relationship with them. Why did they lose their life, not me? And we can feel guilty just for being survivors of these experiences. So really the goal with cognitive processing therapy is to examine some of those beliefs, to challenge some of those beliefs, and to identify more balanced ways of thinking that incorporate some of the evidence that we didn't think about before, to help find closure and to help balance our understandings about our role in these traumatic events, which can be a very powerful experience. Homework in these types of meetings usually entails a lot of worksheets because we're developing a new tool. We're trying to understand and build awareness of our thinking and how our thinking affects our mood and our beliefs. I also wanted to end a little bit about family considerations as we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. So I spent this whole time talking about the disorder, about the treatments that we offer, but I think it's really important to note that this has often a really significant negative impact on family as well. One of the core domains that are affected by trauma is trust. And that actually can go two ways. So sometimes we struggle with trusting other people. If I open myself up to others again, I could get hurt. I lost someone I really cared about. I don't want to be vulnerable ever again, so I'm not going to trust others to open up to them. Or I was betrayed or let down by someone, so I'm never going to open up and trust again. Obviously, that can have a huge impact on our relationships with people we're close to. But it can also be a mistrust of ourselves, not trusting our own emotions, not trusting that we can handle our emotions. I'm going to lose control. I can't express myself. I'm going to uh, uh, be unable to hold back my anger or my sadness. And then, of course, looking at trust as black and white can be really problematic. So thinking of either trusting someone or not trusting someone as the only two options, when in fact, oftentimes we separate our trust dependent upon the person. So sometimes we might trust someone to borrow 10 bucks, but we wouldn't necessarily trust them to hold our difficult emotions or feelings. Or maybe there is someone else we do trust to open up to and to share some of our difficult feelings or thoughts, but we wouldn't expect them to show up on time if they are picking us up to give us a ride. So trust can really be hard to articulate after a traumatic event because we're putting it in these all or nothing camps. Anger as avoidance can be another challenge as well. So oftentimes anger is a very comfortable and familiar emotion for those who served in the military. It's one of the only emotions that's really considered okay or acceptable. And oftentimes it is honed in as a means to serve mission objectives, to motivate us with aggression, to overcome obstacles. It's a very powerful emotion. The military oftentimes tries to utilize it in a way that's effective for that mission. And so it's a comfortable emotion, it's a familiar emotion. Sometimes it's an easier emotion to experience than some of our more difficult, raw emotions. So this can be more comfortable than sadness or shame that we might feel, or grief. And so sometimes anger can be an avoidance strategy because we find excuses to be mad, or we look for some way to divert that energy of emotion away from that really uncomfortable emotion towards anger. We lash out for small reasons at times, and in some ways can mask that underlying emotion. And lastly, this idea that civilians can't understand. So on the one hand, this idea can be from just simply the unique experiences of the military. And as veterans, it can be hard to imagine that our loved ones can even offer us support without understanding that experience. It can also be, though, a concern that judgment might come about in terms of our actions or inaction because of ignorance on the part of our family members, not knowing the difficult decision we had to make because they've never experienced something like that. And so it can be very difficult to open up or share because of a worry about that judgment as well. And as family members, oftentimes you might have nothing but the greatest love or respect or desire to be closer to your veteran loved one. And this can create a really big wall or barrier in those relationships because of that concern from them on the part of their family's ability to understand. So I appreciate your time listening to this information. I hope this was helpful. You can also check out more information at homebase.org about the services that we offer and the treatments of PTSD that we offer here as well. But thank you very much for your time.